everybody. I'm Philip, and thanks for watching this video in my motivational series called How to Fly with a Clipped Wing. In my last video, I talked about some of the different experiences after my spinal cord injury that inspired the clipped wing aspect of the title. But today I'd like to take you back before all of that, to my life way before the motorcycle accident. As I mentioned before, surfing and riding motorcycles were both a huge part of who I was growing up. So I think it'd be kind of cool to talk about why these activities meant so much to me, what it was like sharing those experiences with my dad, who my dad even was, the things I saw him struggle with, and why it was so heavy when he died from his heart attack. I also think it'd be kind of cool to go back to where my interest of flight came from. So I'll be doing this in 3 parts, this of course being the first part. So yeah, with flight, the first thing I ever wanted to be was a pilot. I was about 7 years old when one day my uncle came over to my house to visit. And he was a fighter pilot in the Air Force in the early 90s and flew planes like the A-10 and the F-4. And I didn't know him very well before this point, obviously, being so young, but I will never forget that day and what he brought with him to show me and my family. He brought a helmet with him that he used while he was out flying fighter planes. And to me, it looked so peculiar because there was also the hose attachment that delivered oxygen to him through a face mask, which kind of made the helmet look like it had almost an elephant trunk thing attached to it. And sitting on our couch, he showed me this helmet and talked to me about flying. From that point on, I was absolutely obsessed with flying all through elementary school. I remember doing school assignments that involved either writing or drawing pictures and writing descriptions of things, all being about airplanes. I watched the movie Top Gun over and over and over again, and I think my dad must have just skipped past the lovemaking parts with Kelly McGillis and Tom Cruise or something, because I don't really remember seeing that early on. I'd even watch programs on the History Channel about flight. I wanted to fly for the Air Force actually too, just like my uncle did, and fly like I had imagined from what I saw in movies and on television. And from that point on, I knew I wanted to be a pilot at some point in my life. My dad played a huge role in continuing this intrigue and obsession that I seemed to be teeming with. I didn't know until later on in life that my dad actually went through a bit of flight training himself between 1979 and 1981. I still have his logbook actually. I carry with me on flights sometimes. Let me get it for you actually here. His logbook, you can see it's kind of like beat up sort of. 1979 up there in the top left. Started November 17th. That's almost the day that I started actually, in mid-November. The remarks and stuff. I carry this with me sometimes, especially when I'm in the plane alone and I want to bring a little bit of him with me. Anyway, my dad definitely encouraged me to pursue flying, and for my 9th birthday he paid for me to go up in an actual airplane on my first flying lesson. I couldn't believe it. The experience was absolutely the best until coming in for a landing. I threw up everywhere. Just long story short, all over the gauges and the knobs and the switches that were in front of you, sort of like in your car, all over the floor, in the carpeting and between the little spaces in the instrument panel. I felt like shit for doing that, and I felt really bad for whoever had to clean that mess up, because it would also get kind of warm in those planes too. Anyways, he'd even take me to air shows too, and the more I saw, the more enamored I became. I wasn't just interested in airplanes, but I also found rocketry super exciting. My dad was always there to launch our different model rockets at the park, or to fly remote controlled airplanes that we build together, or to put together models of airplanes that we'd get from the hobby store that we'd put together in our garage. He was just the man. And around this time, he taught me how to surf too. I remember him letting me help strap his surfboard on top of the car, and him driving us down to a cove near my house where he first learned to surf. He taught me how to paddle out, how to read the waves as they would roll in sets. He taught me how to recognize currents by standing on higher ground and looking out over the water. I even struggled for a long time figuring out how to paddle into a wave without pitching over head first, but he always encouraged me to never give up. He'd even take us down south between Los Angeles and San Diego on surf trips where we'd camp out. One thing I loved to do when I was really young was ride a small bicycle that I got one Christmas. So After some time, he introduced me to riding motorcycles. Really early on, he'd take me on the back of his motorcycle, and I remember hugging onto him tightly and clasping onto him. And he bought me my first motorcycle when I was still pretty young. A beat up old Honda scooter. Must have been like an 80cc engine or something. No gears, just twist and go. And I remember him working with me on how to stabilize the small bike and helping me gain confidence in twisting the throttle and learning how to control the power and how to use it responsibly and to appreciate it. And as I grew older, he picked up a dirt bike for us to work on and to take out to the desert. It was an old Suzuki 125, and we ended up taking it out a few times up north a bit from my house in a nice spot called Gorman. But I mostly gravitated toward street bikes rather than dirt bikes after that point. And when I was 14, he bought a street bike that needed a lot of work done to it. I mean, you couldn't even, you could barely even move the thing. The wheels were so gummed up from the bike sitting there for like 10 years before that point. You couldn't even twist the throttle from all the gunk in there. But this was our first real big project together. It was so exciting. I remember him teaching me about the pieces of the motorcycle and how the motorcycle really worked, especially as we started cleaning up the carburetors. That was a lot of fun. I remember being out in the garage with him and washing the carburetors in acid. And I remember the night we finally had the whole system cleaned up pretty significantly, except for the fuel delivery, to the engine from the tank. But that night, when we got the bike to fire finally and successfully combust, although it was combusting in short choking spurts, but it was actually firing while he had me spraying fuel into the carburetors with a spray can. Both of us were so excited, and I remember our neighbors actually wondering what in the hell was even going on. They came out because it was pretty late into the night when this happened, so they're like, what the hell, But we were a bit too happy from our hard-earned success to just let the throttle idle. We were definitely twisting that thing, to put it lightly. Yeah, he had a cruiser that he commuted on regularly, like to work. And then the second one, the street bike, that was for us to work on and to share. This was my first real exposure to street bikes, and I was absolutely hooked. He and I would ride side by side together while I was on this one and while he was on his cruiser. Riding was just so rejuvenating, especially the street bike really seemed to speak to my deepest, most inner self and was just so exciting and exhilarating. I had spent years learning to ride different motorcycles that he exposed me to, and I had discovered an intense feeling of togetherness between me and the bike. Same thing with surfing. Such an interesting thing happens when you're operating this thing that's definitely man-made, but brings you that much closer to nature and establishes such a more intimate and connected experience with nature. You can't beat it. And this is why surfing and riding motorcycles were such an integral part of my identity. It brought me closer to my dad in ways that felt magical, and it also helped give great vibrancy and greater joy, higher purpose to my life while I dealt with things like my parents' divorce and not doing well in school basically all of my life until after high school. When I was old enough to get my permit, we sold this street bike and that we worked on together, and with the profit we made on it and carrying the memories with us forward, he put a down payment on a brand new street bike. I was the luckiest kid growing up, for sure, without doubt, especially that he'd do all of this for me and to expose me to these experiences, these unique experiences, and to be so encouraging and confident in me. Just love that guy. With me on that bike and him on his cruiser, we would get up some mornings and ride together through the Malibu canyons, waking up some of those beautiful mornings before dawn even broke, and we'd be outside geared up and warming our hands around our exhaust pipes, and then heading out, riding through the canyons and watching the sunrise peeking out over the mountain tops over there, being so relatively close to the ocean while we would ride together. Or we'd go riding around the city where I'd live, and sometimes at red traffic lights we would stand our bikes up on their kickstands and switch bikes and ride off for a little while before switching again. It was just, it was awesome. It was mostly awesome. But there were definitely times of darkness. Just like everyone, he struggled with his own demons and stresses. He always made time for me and my younger brother and sister, but he still worked a lot. He had a rough childhood and was sort of a black sheep, I guess you could say. He was an alcoholic, and even eventually admitted to that fact, actually going to AA meetings at one point and trying to get healthier. And there were nights when he would have had too much, and I remember knowing only then when something was burdening him and the weight of stresses in his life were too much for him to handle without the alcohol. He would even sometimes do sort of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type of transformation, when he was drunk, and would even be, verbally abusive or slurring, or he would be the most emotional drunk you'd ever seen, like crying at a baby food commercial or something, going between two huge extremes. And it never made sense to me how substance abuse could change a person so much until I struggled with it myself after my spinal cord injury. He smoked a lot though too. Apparently he smoked cigarettes for a long time before I was born, at which point he completely stopped. But then he started smoking cigars regularly as I got older. He seemed to always have a cigar and a glass of scotch in hand, sitting outside every night, jotting down thoughts, and seemed to be enjoying the solitude amongst the turbulence that was surely going on in his head. Little did any of us know that his health was getting ready for a sharp decline in early January 2005. But for now, this was essentially my life growing up, and a bird's eye view of why these things meant so much to me. Riding motorcycles, surfing, wanting to fly, hobby stuff like the rocketry and building models. It was all there, even though my dad seemed to be constantly at an internal tug of war with himself, giving his kids everything he never had, and suffering the addictive consequences of lacking that love and stability and social engagement in his life growing up. So in the next video, part 2, I'll pick up from right here and what happened to my dad, some details of the accident that happened a year later, of my motorcycle accident that happened a year later, and from that point on. But for now, all I have to say is when this video is over, please give your parents or your family members a call, especially if you think that they need emotional support. Tell them that you love them. Tell them, before one day you physically can't anymore. Be interested in what they're doing, learn to forgive them, love them for who they are at their core, even if they don't make good decisions, sometimes, and can sometimes even be hurtful. We're all trying to go through our lives being loved, and by giving love, by being accepted, and by giving acceptance, tell them that you love them before they're gone. I'll see you next time.